All right, should be live-ish or mostly. And we'll just do the usual test to make sure everything's working. All right, should be, yeah, there we go. All right, so Leonard Susskind video. I'm just doing the two-slit experiment and, describing it. And, it's the foundational kind of argument in defense of a lot of their quantum mechanical woo is revolves around how photons react when you force them through a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller aperture, which is Newton's rings, which is a 300-year-old phenomenon. And they decided 100 years ago to make that phenomenon into a whole foundation for a bunch of stories about how photons have random power and they don't have a location, and all of this magical crap is based on this experiment and the consequences, what was revealed. And again, it's just a story they've made up about the cause. We know what the effect is. The effect isn't that intricate or involved or complicated. And yet their explanation for the uncomplicated outcome is incredibly complicated and bizarre and strange. And so again, this is extraordinary claims, not even ordinary evidence, and a bunch of argumentation as if this can be the only possible explanation. Nobody could possibly explain it with any other mechanism. When, of course, I think there's lots of ways of rationally dissecting the effect and recognizing that it could have many just common, simple causes. All right. So that's the premise. Foundational experiment, and they can never, not one of these physics teachers, highly paid, highly regarded physics teachers, can explain it accurately. Ever. I mean, they could just never tell the story right about even what the effects are. They can't even get the effects right, let alone defend logically the mush they came up with as causes.
It could be a laser shooting out photons, but imagine the photons are coming through one at a time, very small number of them, quanta of light, one at a time, one every 5 minutes, if you like. I don't know, just to go to some extreme situation. These are the photons coming out of the photon gun.
So he's just establishing the fact that the context of the experiment in its most interesting state is the idea that if you send these photons, the photons themselves can't be interacting, that if you send them in single, one at a time, they end up with the same effect. So this isn't something to do with crowding the photons or some other, it's just a way of dissecting the experiment and explaining, getting to the core foundational phenomenon. But again, he doesn't do that either accurate to the truth, representing the truth, or in any kind of explicit detail.
And the photons pass through a obstacle with a little hole in it. All right, this is a two-dimensional diagram of a three-dimensional.
Right, so he says a hole, but obviously the hole would not create the bar pattern. So if you want to have the bar pattern, you have to force it to be a vertical, more vertical than horizontal. You have to stretch the hole into a slit. That's why they call it the two-slit, is because that's what makes it most obvious. But obviously a ringed pattern would be, maybe that would be too reminiscent of the 300-year-old Newton discovery, the fact that Newton discovered this phenomenon 300 years ago. And that would be maybe too indicative of well, why did it take you 200 years to come up with this preposterous explanation? And why for 100 years have you stuck to a plainly made up, imagined story of function.
Dimensional situation. This blue object over here is intended to be a disk with a tiny hole in it.
Right. So the blue object is intended to be, he says, a disk with a hole in it. It's a solid object made out of matter. Now, the first thing you would think physicists would, sort of be understand is that matter isn't some kind of flat thing, like a piece of, like we see it. We see matter as it's not matter, it's matter, not matter, matter. And there's this line. We see it as like a hard line, but there's no hard line in reality. In reality, there's atoms with electrons. So you could almost say that at minimum, a physicist should understand that atoms are basically round objects that from their own model, and that those round objects wouldn't fit together in some straight line. It would have stuff that sticks out and stuff that's in and stuff that sticks out and stuff that's in. It would have an edge to it. There wouldn't be a perfect line. So there'd be no such thing as a straight line where you're interacting with these photons. And as you make the slit narrower and narrower, the idea that the photon goes nearer the surface goes up, right? So if you have 10 photons in this much space, well, then you got lots of opportunity for the photon not to be anywhere near one of the two hands. But if the 10 photons have to go through this narrower space, well, then there's a higher probability that they're going to be close to a hand. Now, that's not exactly more than a grammar school reasoning as something that should be accounted for, at least mentioned somewhere in this process, that yes, we understand that the photon is a tiny thing and it interacts with tiny things like electrons, and that those electrons aren't in some line that represents matter.
So the photons can go through and they come out the other side of the hole. And when they come out the other side of the hole, they eventually get to a screen over here. That screen records the photon by a flash.
So another thing they don't really illustrate is the fact that everything diverges in these experiments. So the screen isn't a projection of what's happening at the slit, in the sense that the line of the photons are obviously not coming out parallel, straight, that some percentage of them, even in their analogy to bowling balls or something, are coming out crooked, not at a straight angle. So the further you move the target, the more you magnify the image of the divergence. So clearly it's a divergence. It just, the photon's not going straight, its angle changes.
Flash of light at the screen, not the flash of the original photons, but another flash of energy appears at a point on the screen and records, or it could be just the blackening of a photographic plate.
So let's understand the beam on the laser beam that seems like a tiny thing is actually bigger than the opening of the slit. So the slit is much smaller than the actual size of the laser beam. And yet at a distance, we don't see something smaller than the dot of a laser beam. We see something that's a pattern. Now, whether that pattern was just a smooth gradation or whether that pattern has these bars in it, the point is that to see it, we have to magnify it, because we couldn't see it if it actually was representing exactly the opening size of the slit. Is so tiny by comparison to the projection.
Something that records the position of the photon when it goes through here. Now, first, let's think classically.
So this is a routine. They play this game with this word classic versus modern. This is called modern physics. It's a lecture done not as a student lecture, but as a lecture on quantum mechanics, the short version sort of kind of lecture, but one that goes into the deepest details of quantum mechanics. It's not a trivial presentation. It'll be heavily involved in mathematics and other stuff. So it's not like it's dumbed down. It's in a sense condensed. So it's not supposed to be inaccurate.
But classically, with a bit of randomness. The bit of randomness that we can imagine is that when the photon goes through here, a little random kick.
Right. So now we have this idea of the random kick, even like Newton would say you could have a random kick. There would be no random kick. There would be a kick from something. There'd be a cause to the effect. And so again, he just doesn't account for any causes. He just pretends it gets a kick. And now we're going to create a fake scenario and compare it to their real scenario. So this fake kick is now going to be compared, a fake kick is going to be compared to their, the universe has a random generator engine that makes photons act funny. So he's now comparing pixies to fairies instead of doing what he should be doing, which is saying, can we assume there to be any influences that might affect a photon when it travels next to a material surface? So the material surface not having a perfect straight line, the matter not being little square blocks that fit together and you're either in matter or you're not in matter. We know that atoms aren't. They're mostly empty space. We know that the thickness of the material might matter in that circumstance. Just like if you were shooting through a range of mountains, you wanted to shoot a light across distance, and there were hills in the way. Well, the more thickness of hills, the more likely it is you hit a hill. You know, just laws of averages. So instead of doing that kind of reasoning, all of that is just thrown away. Classic mechanics isn't allowed to use classic mechanisms for an interference with the photon. The photon, he doesn't describe a single possible classical mechanism that would disturb a photon. He just makes up a random kick. There is no random kick. You know.
Might influence the photon and either kick it upwards or downwards. In fact, by a random amount. What would we expect then? Well, if there was no randomness, then the photons would go straight through and illuminate a single point. Be completely deterministic.
Right, and it'd be a tinier dot than the laser beam that went in. So it'd be a smaller spot than the laser beam that went in if there was no phenomenon associated with making an opening smaller and increasing the likelihood that a photon travels close to a surface. So let's understand again, you can do this experiment with a needle, all right, and you'll get the same pattern. So this really isn't about openings. This isn't about slits or holes. It's about surfaces and the fact that when photons travel next to surfaces, they have a probability, a likelihood of being disturbed, of being kicked, of interacting with something associated with the matter. They interact with that, and it causes them to deflect in a different direction.
The photons would always arrive at exactly the same point, if the hole was small enough, and if the beam of photons was narrow enough.
Well, again, the beam wouldn't have anything to do with it, in a sense, because the beam is automatically made moot by the new aperture, which is going to confine the angle which with the light can get through the hole. If it's a too sharp an angle, it couldn't possibly get in the hole or manage getting through the hole. So clearly the source would have very little to do with the outcome. And the fact is that we, again, everybody agrees, Newton discovered that light is affected when you start forcing it next to material surfaces, to travel next to a material surface. I mean, this is the plainly factual, obvious elephant in the room fact of this experiment is this is really about surfaces. That we can deduce. The needle experiment demonstrates it. This isn't about holes. It's not, you don't put a needle in the way of the light and say, this the two-hole experiment. Some people do, but I mean, obviously that doesn't make much sense. Clearly what's happening is the surfaces are what affects the photons.
Now we can imagine a random kick. What does the random kick do?
So again, this random thing, a physicist talking about a random as if that's a legitimate causal mechanism. So you might as well say, why don't we just call it a random God act? Because essentially it has no accounting. Saying there's a random kick by no cause, by no mechanical device. The photon didn't hit something and get kicked. No explanation for this random movement. Physics shouldn't do that.
Well, it changes the direction of the photon, not the whole photon beam, but one photon at a time. It might kick the first photon up a little bit, the second photon down.
Right. So if you were looking at this as a probabilistic thing and there was things in your way that could kick you, like dominoes or some little things. So the surface has little lumps on it. And the photon's going to travel through those lumps. So the lump could be here, lump could be here, lump could be here. There could be two lumps in a row. So there could be various amounts of this lump. And every time that you hit the lump, you get deflected 3 degrees. So depending on how many of the lumps you hit, depends on how many degrees your path gets distorted. Simple explanation. Yes, I have to account for what the lumps are, but as I've just given you some indication of how the orbits of atoms, as they're connected on a surface, could be protruding in different ways. So you could have 3 orbits sticking out on one atom and only 1 orbit on the other one, and 3 and 1. And so depending on which location you go through, you'll hit a more intense electron. Something like that could explain it. It'll be a 6-degree electron instead of a 3-degree electron.
And so forth and so on. Eventually, what you will see is a blob of illumination on the screen over here.
Right. So now we know this isn't factually accurate. Besides the fact that he can't draw it even close, even though he has 2 little dots kind of representing a straight line, he still couldn't draw it even close to where it should be. I mean, obviously the peak should be, a 10% higher than he drew it. But whatever. And clearly this isn't what happens. So we already know from Newton that with photons, this isn't what happens. Photons aren't bowling balls. Photons aren't baseballs. We can't make a surface like this lighter. The surface is smooth from our perspective, from our gigantic perspective, from a bowling ball's perspective. There's no lumps or bumps that could be detected because it's so much bigger than the surface. The surface, this is a surface phenomenon, but it's a surface phenomenon that has to do with atoms. It can't affect anything that atoms individually can't affect. So if the little nuances of the atoms, which are tiny, okay, the Earth is to an apple what an atom is to an apple in terms of the size. There's as many atoms in an apple as there are apples in the Earth. So we're talking about a very tiny phenomenon happening. So obviously bowling balls ain't going to matter. They're not going to be affected by the unevenness of this atomic surface. So if we wanted to do the experiment fairly with bowling balls, we'd have to create a surface that had very huge irregularities in it. Well, then maybe the bowling ball experiment could actually work. If you put something in the way of the bowling ball where if it hits this lump, it gets slowed down and, and the slowness will deflect its path. you could end up with a pattern. All right, but clearly we know with photons, this doesn't happen. So this diagram has nothing to do with our 300-year-old expectations. Somebody since Newton should not expect photons to go through this slit and end up in a bulge on the other side. Since Newton, since 300 years ago, the informed and intelligent man's expectation would be, oh, no, of course, there'll be a pattern. There'll be Newton's rings. That's a 300-year-old intelligent expectation. And yet he's talking now and saying this should be our expectation. No, it shouldn't be our expectation. And it certainly isn't the facts. The facts we already know. It doesn't do that. So why is he doing this? Why is he presenting this argument as if this is how it behaves when it doesn't behave this way?
On the average, the photon might go straight ahead, so the blob might be most intense at the center. It might be highly improbable to knock the photon through 60 or 70 degrees.
Right, and their argument would be it could knock it 89 degrees. It could knock it a preposterous. Their theory says the possibility is almost infinite in terms of how you can gradate it, and it certainly can go all the way to 90 degrees almost in terms of their perception of deflection. Like they don't have no evidence that a photon ever did that a photon ever deflected 90 degrees coming out of the slit. They have no evidence that ever happens. They have never done the experiment to see if they could detect a photon that in this case would be going straight up or straight down after it comes out of the slit. They've never done that experiment. This is their foundation for their theory, and yet they haven't proven it by that simple experiment. I mean, that experiment would indicate an awful lot in terms of demonstrating that it is possible to create a huge amount of deflection, not just some, but a huge amount. But they don't prove it with an experiment.
So the signal would fade as you moved away from the center. You would see a blob, a maximum intensity.
So it would never fade to zero. That is the point. It would go theoretically very far away. If you had a flat screen, you could go miles away and you'd still be able to find a photon going that sharp an angle. Yet they've never demonstrated that to be a truth.
Near the center and thinning out as you move far away. And you might describe it by a probability function.
Right. So we've described this non-event, this thing we already know doesn't happen. They're not ping pong balls going through this big a hole. They're not bowling balls going through a giant hole. They're not any of these things. They're photons, the smallest thing in the universe, moving the speed of light, that always go in a straight line in every experiment you can do that's simple, unless they hit something called an electron. And that's the evidence. That's what we have really hard evidence demonstrating over and over again. That's something photons do routinely, is interact with electrons. That's their most famous act. That's what they're known for.
Probability function being the probability that the photon arrives in different places.
Right, so we already know there's no probability function for that drawing with photons. The photons will not create that lump, unless the slit is huge. And that's just a fact.
Now we go, now we do the same thing in real quantum mechanics. In other words, in the real world.
Real quantum mechanics is the real world. See, this prejudice is just so... it's propaganda.
We see essentially the same thing. The photons go through the hole with no ability to control the situation.
Yes, but no, the situation, again, is what you're supposed to be dissecting. You're supposed to be looking at the results of the experiment and saying, why is this happening? And they're just going into it saying, we like the idea of random, and we like the idea of Heisenberg being some kind of reality. That is, that photons don't exist until we discover them, until we force them to interact with something we can detect. And otherwise they don't, they don't have a reality. And it's their nonsensical, magical notion, and they're forcing the evidence to fit it. This is just evidence being forced to fit a theory, not the other way around, where the evidence points to a theory. There's nothing about the phenomenon that points to any need to do Heisenberg, to give photons magic powers, or any of that crap, when the slits are sitting there right in front of you saying, I'm part of this experiment. I'm a material thing in the experiment. Could you please account for me existing? Please? They don't account for the surfaces at all. The surfaces are irrelevant as physics objects in the experiment, and they have real physics. And that's why the experiment happens, is because of the physics of the surfaces.
We find out that the photons again create a blob like this. But now we're going to do
so he says quantum mechanics says the same thing, but it doesn't say the same thing, and it doesn't happen in reality. So he just says, let's do quantum mechanics in reality, when we know reality doesn't do that. And we've known it since Newton. So again, he's describing something that we've known not to be true since Isaac the fuck Newton. And he's a teacher of physics.
Something a little different. And I think everybody here more or less.
Right. So he's going to say we're going to do something different when there's absolutely nothing different. He's just adding another two surfaces to the experiment. And as a physicist, you should know this is going to have a consequence, that all of these material objects, in a sense, are entangled in a way, not in their magic entanglement way, but they're entangled in a way that there's real forces involved. And you can't change the matter in one location without affecting the matter in another location when they're tied together. And they always tend to be tied together by static electricity, or they're tied together by their atomic structure, or by heat, or by lots of other ways that the two atoms separated have lots of mechanisms that force them to be aware of each other.
Everybody knows what I'm going to do. I'm going to open a second hole. Okay, but let's think about
okay, so he opens a second hole, and he again, the lack of precision and care in describing what this is a consequence of. So again, this is a tiny hole with a tiny impediment in between and another tiny hole, tiny. And he's going to talk about a giant image we see. So again, you have to understand the image is being projected by divergence, by the fact that the photons are not going through straight, that they're being diverged. And he doesn't even pay attention to that fact.
The classical randomness would do. Classical randomness would simply mean that, and we'll also imagine that this beam of photons.
So again, classic is supposed to be ignorant of the single slit experiment, when clearly it's a Newton experiment. So again, just understand that. He's saying we're going to do a classical description, and classic usually has something to do with Newton's error. And yet in Newton's error, it was already known that photons are bent, diffracted by apertures, small apertures, by being forced to interact with surfaces.
Is at its origin a little bit uncertain and a little bit random, so that some photons begin a little bit upward, some photons a little bit downward, some photons go through the upper hole, some photons go through the lower hole.
What would be irrelevant if you're conceding that the beams are basically collated, they're parallel. For all intents and purposes, especially with a laser beam, and you get very little diffraction over distance. So if you just shot the laser beam on the target, it would be a little bigger than it would be at half the distance or at the slits, but it wouldn't be a lot bigger, maybe twice as big. So instead of a millimeter, it'd be 2 millimeters, but that's it. We're talking about a divergence that's going to be in the range of measuring in inches, feet of divergence.
If a photon goes through the upper hole, it may or may not get a random kick and get knocked off.
So again, a random kick from what? Why talk about random kicks? Well, how is that professional physics to just throw the word random kick without explaining, well, from what? Heat? From where does this random kick come? What's causing the random kick?
Well, of course, if it goes through the lower hole, it also gets a random kick. Now we're imagining the photons come through one at a time. We can even imagine a... Okay. I do that all the time.
Fart, I guess. Somebody farted. He said he does it all the time, so I don't know. Fall asleep?
Where was I? Yes. The photons get a kick. We're imagining that the photons come through one at a time, very sparsely. And so what one photon does doesn't influence a later photon because the later photon comes through so much.
Right. So then this is the classic argument that, well, how do you end up with a consistent pattern if one photon doesn't know what the other photon does, which is kind of as silly as saying, if I'm flipping a coin, somehow the coin knows that, oh, you flipped 10 heads in a row. You can't do that anymore. So we have to make a tail. It doesn't do that. The probability is set by each circumstance. So clearly each photon is not being affected by other photons or what other photons did. It's being affected by the environment it's running through. And it's just has a probability. If I put a bunch of swords in front of a hole and ask you to jump through it, the probability of you getting through without hitting one of the swords will just be a matter of whether you try to jump a little higher and you might hit one of the top swords, or you jump a little lower or left or right, or trying to get your angles right. But that's just going to be the probability. Each jump is going to be a new jump. The previous jumps aren't going to demand that you jump somewhere else. It doesn't change the probability any. The fact that the one photon hit the mountain doesn't mean the next photon doesn't hit the mountain. The next photon can hit the mountain too. It'll all work out in the end as being a probability. If there's 5 inches of open space and 2 inches of closed space, then the results will be more things will go through the open space than the closed space. Nothing magical necessary.
Later, that whatever gave the first photon a kick is already finished happening, and it's waiting for the next throw of the dice.
So again, the throw of the dice, these are really poor metaphors, but they're all ones that are, in a sense, are part of the engineering of this propaganda. This is a classic point that Einstein made. God doesn't play dice with the universe. They're sort of almost mocking it by throwing this crap in here, this random kick and the throwing of the dice, when no, clearly it's about throwing things at slits that have character, that have substance. They're material objects. They have substance. And when you force a photon to interact with them, they interact. Something happens to the photons. The photons don't do something. The environment does it to them. That's the simple, observable facts here. It's non-reasonable to jump to the conclusion the photon does something when clearly changing the material circumstances, changing how big the slit is, changing how thick the material is, changes what the photons do. Clearly, the matter is controlling the experiment.
The next photon may come through 100 throws of the dice later. And so we expect the next photon to be random, statistically independent of the first photon. Under those circumstances, what we would expect. Well, let's decide what we would expect.
So again, we already know from Newton's time that we have a small aperture. We have 2 of them next to each other. We know we're not going to get just some dopey lump. So that's not going to be our rational expectation since classical Newton's time.
Supposing only one hole is open, if only one hole was open, then we would see a blob of illumination like that, with a profile that might look something like that. Supposing we closed up the first blob, the first hole, and opened.
So this is another classic mistake they make, where these apertures are a tiny distance from each other, and yet they'll draw the second blob. I don't know if he's going to draw the second blob very far from each other, and they won't be far from each other. The aperture is tiny, and so the amount of difference between going through the one hole or going through the other hole is so minute that you won't even see it at a distance. At a distance, you wouldn't be able to see the difference between the two patterns if the two patterns were the same. That is, if there wasn't any effect in terms of the matter, the slits being different. That is, the interior slits, the surfaces on the inside, on the tiny impediment, and the surfaces on the outside being different, probably in some kind of static charge way, which is perfectly consistent with what we know about how static charge works. That the outside surfaces will have a greater electrical potential than the interior surfaces.
The second hole. Close the first one, open the second one. All right, so first we begin with just one hole. Then we close the first hole and open the second hole. What would you expect to see?
So these are experiments they really haven't done because mechanically they're very difficult to do, because any material you interject into the experiment will affect the pattern you get. And so that's the catch here. But let's continue.
What you would expect to see under those circumstances is a different blob slightly displaced from the first one.
Right. Now, that's not exactly slightly displaced. So the slightly displaced would be so small an amount that you wouldn't be able to see it at the distance you have to project the image. So it's such a tiny bit that the two, like two projectors on a movie screen, the two projectors are so close to each other that the image they're producing is, there's just barely no fuzziness. Now, the further away I put them, the more I'm going to get fuzziness, or the angles I point them at, of course. But the fact is, these two origins are so close to each other that they're almost a single point source. And so there wouldn't be much difference in where these patterns show up.
The blue blob wouldn't be there because we closed the first hole. The green blob would be there because we opened the second hole.
So again, we already know that this doesn't happen with photons. So this whole blob thing is stupid. It's just a waste of time because it doesn't happen in reality. And we've already known that for 300 years. So for 300 years, we've known this isn't about stupid blobs. So why don't you get to an actual fact? Why don't you get to the actual facts that happen when you do these experiments? When you open a tiny slit, you get a pattern. You put two slits next to each other, then you can talk about, well, the pattern should overlap. That might be what you would expect. And they don't overlap. So that's the result that now you have to explain. And as I just explained, you could explain it by just pointing out that static charges on surfaces change when you create these different surfaces. Different surfaces have a different circumstance, and therefore they will produce a different effect.
Now, what happens if we open both holes? What happens if you open both holes in classical mechanics is the probability for a photon to get to the screen at any given point is the sum of the probabilities for it to get there by either.
Right. So he's arguing a circumstance that doesn't exist. Now, the idea that the two sum by logic, you have two slits and you have them 15 feet apart and then you start moving them closer together. There's a point where you have to say they're going to just overlap because the tiny bit of difference at the source, the less than a millimeter distance, is not going to make enough of a difference in the pattern for you to see two separate patterns displayed. They're going to overlap on top of each other. And that would be your expectation, that they would sum, that you would see, if you were seeing a bar pattern, you'd see just the same bar pattern twice as bright because now you have two openings, twice as many photons. That's a logical inference. But again, we already know from doing the experiment that that's not what happens. And we can reason that that doesn't happen because Yeah, the slits on the inside are different than the slits on the outside. Their material structure is different. Their atomic weight is different. Their mass is different. They're different surfaces. And they'll bend photons differently now.
The root. The photon can either go through the upper root or it can go through the lower root if both holes are open. The probability to get to this point over here, let's call it the green point over here. The probability.
Okay, well, again, he drew it so poorly that, it almost, it's almost breaks reasoning just because he, did a poor job of rendering. All right, so a lot of deleted comments. So we'll do some comments, see if you idiots are getting any of this. What is work? Is it only microscopic? There's only one universe, so yeah, all the work happens at the photonic level. That's the only universe that's really a universe. The tiny universe is the universe. The big stuff is interesting, but it only does what it does because the tiny universe does it. The tiny universe does all the work. Isn't that a transfer of energy through force? Again, the words used as if energy is something other than force is kind of idiotic. Energy is a reveal of force. When you see something energetic, a force did it. Nothing else did it. How thick is the wall around the hole? Yeah, see, that's important. And they really don't do these experiments. They really don't care enough to actually do the experiment and try ones that are, from nanometers thick, very thin layers. They have used thin layers of gold. In one case, the layers were so thin that the light went right through the gold. So they had to thicken it up. But yeah, they really haven't done enough experimentation to really dissect this experiment. They just haven't bothered. And clearly it's a hugely significant fact that if you thicken the material, you make the pattern, you change the pattern. Does it angularly influence the photons? Yes. Does the interference happen non-horizontally? No, of course it does, but you just don't see it because you stretch the pattern. So you're forcing the circle to go, it has a little circle at the bottom and then has a big circle this way. So you're forcing the pattern to spread the way you want to view it by changing the shape of the material. You claiming it's an interference pattern, let's just put it in quotes, it's not an interference pattern. It's an on-off pattern. It's a pattern of diffraction, at precise energy levels. So just like their atom has precise energy levels, and they're perfectly comfortable with that, there's precise deflection levels that take place when photons move past surfaces. And they're just simple angle changes. 3 degrees, 6 degrees, 12 degrees. Well, 9 degrees, 12 degrees, simple. Is this effect in any way related to depth of field? Not the one being described, no. Being increased by creating a more narrow aperture in a camera. It's related in the sense, let's see, get myself into trouble, that it's all about the angles that the light has to go through. So the lens in a sense becomes a filter. It can only see light that's moving at precise angles, and light that doesn't come in at those precise angles becomes invisible, and that becomes your field, your focused field, and everything else starts losing continuity. You have to dial up the f-stop, but the exposure requires more light intensity. Of course, yes, the smaller the hole, obviously you have to increase the exposure time. Yes. All right. So back to the live video. It's not live, but this part is live, me. Anyway, I hope it's loud enough. I got everything up all the way, but it's, I don't know what it is with this computer, but I can't seem to get much volume out of it.
Probability to get over there is the probability to go through the upper hole and arrive at the green point, plus the probability to go through the lower hole and arrive at the green point. So the result is, in classical physics, you would always see the signal over here, the profile over here, just being the sum of the two probability distributions.
Right, and that's all it is in quantum mechanics. So again, there's this is just part of the propaganda, as if quantum mechanics means something different. No, quantum mechanics is just establishing that we're going to use a Huygens idea that the waves break into curved waves, and then we're going to use curved waves to create interference. So we have an excuse to have two different patterns. But it's the same logic is going to be applied, that it would be a sum if it wasn't for Huygens turning flat waves into curved waves. So it's all about their causes again. Their causes are what changes it. Their quantum mechanics math doesn't do anything else but sum.
And it would look, I wish I had another color. They never leave me enough colors. All right. We would see something which would look like.
Well, using blue and green doesn't really work anyway. Just FYI.
That's the higher. I don't know. It would be much bigger than that.
Yes, obviously it'd be bigger than that. It'd be twice this high. Yes.
It would look like that.
Better.
And in particular, if there was any point over here such that the photon could arrive either.
So let's understand, even his drawing is a misrepresentation of their theory, in the sense that they have it disappear to infinity really early, when by their math and their logic, it doesn't do that. It goes quite a distance forever. And they should be able to detect those photons on those faraway peripheries, and they've never even tried. They've never tested their own theory.
One hole, or from the other hole, or both, then we would find illumination at that point for sure by opening both holes.
So the simple logic is it's a tiny aperture, and most of the photons don't hit anything. So they still go between the aperture. That is, they don't go really close to the surface. So they just go in a straight line, and they end up at the end of the target. And most of them end up that way, even when there's a pattern. The interference pattern, 85% of the light still ends up in the middle, and the rest of the pattern is much weaker by comparison to the central maxima. So let's understand, that's part of the facts here.
That's what classical logic, let's call it by its right name, classical logic. That's what classical logic, classical statistics, classical probability would dictate.
And again, this has nothing to do with quantum mechanics not doing classical probability. It does do classical probability. It's just that it invents a cause that's Mr. Random, the invisible probability maker. Their cause is what is illogical in their theory, not their description of how you do mathematics, which is you usually add things. It makes sense. Two things can get added.
For a series of particles coming through here, one at a time. When they come through one at a time, they make blip, 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 blip. But the average probability of the distribution of blips would be a distribution which would be the sum of the two.
So again, he's arguing that this is classical. It's not classical. Newton already knew this wouldn't happen. So again, if Newton would have been asked about putting two apertures next to each other, I'm sure he would have pointed out that he doesn't know what's going to happen because he hasn't done the experiment. So, you know, but and again, 100 years later, Young does the experiment, and everybody is marvels about it 100 years after that. So 100 years after Young, they all of a sudden say, isn't this an interesting phenomenon? We didn't pay any attention to it for 100 years, but now we're going to pay attention to it. And now we're going to think it's important. And clearly, Newton's rings already existed. And that's really the phenomenon. So the phenomenon was first discovered by Newton, and he and his classical logic could dissect it. Now, he didn't have an explanation for it because he didn't know what atoms were, and he didn't know what electrons were, and he didn't know what photons were. So he only knew certain things about them. So he couldn't really speculate on what was causing it because he didn't have enough knowledge to do any decent speculation.
Distribution. What happens if you really do this experiment? You find what's called an interference pattern.
You'll find an on-off pattern. Yes. Light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. Doesn't have to be caused by anything called interference. Lots of ways to cause on, off, on, off, on, off. Lots of ways to cause deflections at different degrees, just like rainbows. You know, lots of ways to do that. Don't have to have anything to do with interference.
The interference pattern is like this. Let's see, get it right.
So still not drawn very well, but whatever. Still doesn't have the peak lined up with the center, you know. So, you know, even though his dot's there, still can't get it right. His reference dot. So anyway, but yes, so now this is the pattern you get, and that's the same pattern you would have got with a single slit, and they've known that for 300 years. So again, this whole thing is just dressed up nonsense. This isn't describing history or this experiment accurately. It's cheating it to make their nonsense seem less nonsensical. They're distorting the evidence, perverting it to fit their silly story.
Particular. So first of all, what is this figure? This figure is a probability distribution, and it tells you.
Yeah, it's you know, to call it a probability distribution is okay, but again, it's a distribution caused by this experiment. So the slits cause the distribution. They cause this effect. It doesn't have to have anything random, kicky, or any of that crap. It's an indication that something happens. And again, he hasn't drawn it very well because the central peak should be much, much larger than the secondaries and the tertiaries.
Horizontal axis here tells you what the probability of a photon getting to a particular point at a particular height here. But in particular, it says that there are no photons which arrive at that point. There are no photons which arrive at that point. There are no photons which arrive at that point. This is odd. If you opened only one.
Right. Now, that's the obvious, that is the thing to be figured out, is why are there no photons in these locations? And the simple answer is because photons only get moved a certain quanta. So again, this is called quantum mechanics. So these are people familiar with the idea of energy being in packets and only distributed in those packets. And yet they can't see that this is a quantum mechanical pattern, that clearly this is something that would be indicative of like their model of the atom energy levels, that you can only be at certain ones. And this is merely an illustration that only certain angles will be possible in terms of the deflection, that the photon isn't deflected 50 degrees or 0.5 degrees or 0.7 degrees or 1.4 degrees. It's always deflected a certain amount by its interaction, a quantized amount. So this is the joke. This is supposed to be quantum mechanics. They're supposed to understand quantized energy packets, and yet they can't see that that pattern is obviously an indication of quantized effect.
One hole, then you would find a probability distribution which wasn't zero. In other words, you would find illumination at that point. You open the other hole, you still find illumination at that point.
Now, let's understand, if you were doing this classical thing where you said, okay, they're both single slits and they're both creating a single slit pattern, and the two single slit patterns then would have to be right on top of each other because the difference between these slits is tiny compared to the difference of this thing here. So understand, this is 1 millimeter, this is 1 meter. Okay, this is huge, gigantic compared to the size of the slits. So the two differences in the position of the slits, the projectors, is infinitesimally small compared to the size of the pattern. And if you were to do the experiment, you'd have no expectation that covering one slit would create a different pattern than covering the other slit. You'd see the same pattern, just weaker. Now, that isn't what happens, so you don't get what you would expect. But the reason why you don't get that, again, can be explained in that the little tiny impediment is a different material structure than the two big surfaces.
You open both holes, and all of a sudden, no photon gets to that point, even though.
So all of a sudden, he says, no photon gets to that point, when we know that, no, there was a pattern from the first slit, and there's a pattern from the second slit. So maybe the two holes don't line up the way they should. Maybe they're off on, you know, one, you cover the left slit, it's bright. You cover the right slit, it's not. But theoretically, you can understand that, no, the two patterns are going to be in the same position. So if you actually did this experiment and you got a single slit pattern out of the double slit, which you're not going to get, the two patterns would be overlapped. And again, the reason why they're not is because you have to understand there's two different mechanisms in the experiment now. There's the two wide opening, and there's the narrow surfaces. So there's this inside surfaces and the outside surfaces, and those two surfaces produce different deflection.
Oh, they're coming through once every 20 minutes or once every 20 years. And therefore, how can they know about each other?
Like, again, that argument is so kind of moot. It's already, it can be logically accepted, even in a classical sense, that this has nothing to do with photons knowing what a previous photon did. The photons themselves are each going through the obstacle course, and there's a certain probability of getting through the obstacle course without having a knife in your head. And that's just the way it works. The slits are essentially an obstacle course that the photons have to go through, and each one has to go through exactly the same obstacle course. And that's the probability.
Nevertheless, if you open both holes, there will be places where no photons can get to, despite the fact that photons arrived at those points when only one hole was open.
So again, he didn't prove that. Didn't do an experiment to prove that. He's just claiming that that's what he surmises the facts would be if he could do the experiment. But he didn't prove it with an experiment. The two patterns are so different, the single slit and the double slit, that it's almost like you can't really compare them, but they're two elaborate patterns. The single slit pattern is an elaborate pattern on its own, and you're combining two elaborate patterns when you put the two slits close to each other. And the key thing to understand is you're combining the two slits with a different surface dynamic. And again, it's sort of logical to know that's exactly how static electricity works, is that depending on the position something is in, it can have different charge on it in an arrangement. So if you make something thicker or thinner, you'll change its electrical potential.
That is, you might be able to sit down and work up some interesting but rather elaborate mechanism to make this happen.
Right. So he's claiming it's elaborate to think of a mechanical reason, a mechanical cause. And I've just given some, that atoms have an uneven shape, that the material edges have a shape to them made by those atoms, that you're hitting different electrons and different electrical potential of electrons, and therefore that could explain why some things go 6 degrees and some things go 3 degrees. It's because you're hitting more bound or less bound electrons. There's simple explanations. And then how thick the material is, again, something they don't just talk about, but clearly could substantially change the pattern because of your more probable of hitting more electrons the thicker the material is. These are perfectly viable explanations, nothing elaborate. You don't have to go into any kind of fantasy land. You don't have to go down any rabbit holes. You don't have to make up any bizarre characters or invisible men. You can come up with clearly reasonable physical explanations for why photons might find going next to matter complicated. a task. You know, to preserve their straight line momentum may be difficult to go through that atmosphere and retain their momentum, their angular momentum, whatever, however you want to describe it, their directional momentum. Yeah, so we'll just finish this off and then we'll go back to comments.
You could imagine elaborate, complicated mechanisms.
So, right, and they're saying that their Heisenberg and their Huygens, these aren't elaborate, bizarre theories of how things function. The random probability kick, the photon breaks into a probability wave and the waves interfere with each other. That's not an elaborate mechanism. That's not some sort of elaborate bullshit. I mean, this is such dishonesty. You know, to say you'd have to strain credulity to come up with a mechanical explanation when they're so straining credulity to come up with their fantasy explanation, their Huygens, Heisenberg, dark energy, dark matter, entanglement bullshit explanation, that somehow that isn't a strain of credulity to come up with some idiotic notion that the fucking photon went through a slit and therefore a whole new universe was created. That doesn't strain credulity, but it strains credulity to come up with a mechanical explanation describing something like, well, atoms aren't flat, straight line surfaces. Atoms don't make straight line surfaces.
Where somehow this screen.
Yeah, somehow the material object that you force the photons to interact with by making the slit small, it has something to do with this experiment. So he's almost mocking the idea that, oh, well, you could consider this material thing that we forced the photons to interact with to have something to do with this, but that would be a waste of brain. I mean, you're wasting your neural energy to do something that logical, to blame the heavy matter for the behavior of the photon, the electron-rich matter, the matter full of electrons, the favorite thing a photon likes to hit. And the matter just happens to be full of the very thing photons love to hit. And we're going to pretend that can't possibly be the explanation when it's clearly the logical explanation.
In here, some degrees of freedom inside the screen. Remember how many photons went through.
Yeah, no need to remember. Again, the probability is so simple. It's just a doubling of an angle. Their mathematics demonstrates it. And let's understand, their mathematics is so rigged, right? Because they use the same formula to do the single slit as the double slit. And when they're doing the single slit experiment, one of the variables, sometimes labeled A, is the width of the slit. And then if they're going to do the math for the double slit, all of a sudden that variable that was the width of the slit turns into the width of the material impediment. A completely different thing. There is no width of the slit in the math anymore, and the only thing in the math is the width of the impediment. Now the impediment is somehow the deciding factor. So before the slit was deciding how the thickness of the slit decides how probable it is you're going to hit close to a surface, and then yes, in the two slit experiment, the thing that's going to decide substantially is how thick the center thing is. And so that's why it's in the math. But again, they changed the variable. The variable isn't the same variable. And they're saying we have continuity. This makes sense. This is logical. And the variable doesn't represent the same variable. I mean, this is just so bad.
Remember what they're supposed to do, but it would be a rather elaborate mechanism.
So again, it's another elaborate mechanism to imagine that material surfaces are in fact not smooth, that atoms don't make smooth surfaces. They make surfaces that have to be, by definition of their own model, their own understanding of what an atom is, which is a huge amount of empty space, a tiny nucleus, and electrons. The only way that, can create a surface is that those electrons have to be in circles, and they have to be, in patterns that aren't going to be smooth. and they have to be in precise distances from the nucleuses, and the nucleuses have to be connected to the other atoms in a precise amount of tension. And so there's going to be a geometry on the surface of everything. Everything's going to have a geometry of the atoms on its surface, and the geometry isn't going to be a flat line. I'm saying grammar school kids can understand that connection. They can understand. You show me them the model of the atom, and you say, now what does that create as a surface? They'll be able to tell you, oh, I can see it's not going to create a straight line. I can see that it's going to create places where there's a lot of electrons, places where there's less electrons, places with more electrons, places where there's less electrons. It's going to create a diverse surface capable of creating diverse outcomes for the photon that goes through that particular area.
Just for this one purpose, this phenomenon of interference, of destructive interference, this is called destructive interference.
They've declared it destructive interference. It has nothing to do with anything interfering with itself. So again, he calls it destructive interference, and he won't even get into there. He didn't even do Huygens and Heisenberg. He didn't even do his silly explanation that the photon creates two wave packets that interfere with each other to create the probability. So he's not even explaining what causes the probability. Again, so no, because he's not even addressing cause. But clearly, when quantum mechanics is forced to address cause, if somebody could tell him, well, what's the cause, he'd have to come up with some kind of nonsense of, oh, well, the photon turns into two wavetons, and the wavetons interfere with each other, and then it turns back into a photon.
That the probabilities cancel instead of adding at certain points. That's a very generic property in quantum mechanics.
Right, and that's not disagreeable. We know this is a known outcome now, that when photons do interact with electrons, that this is how they interact. They interact by changing their direction, by changing their momentum based on how the electron is moved. And we know that in most cases, the original photon isn't the photon the electron allows to be released. So the real point is that the photon is absorbed by the electron as momentum in its field that it's caught in between the other electrons. You have tension between the electrons, and the pressure is distributed between the electrons. And it's when that regains balance that the extra new photon is created, and that reflections aren't the same photon being reflected.
And so it requires a kind of explanation, which is not some detailed mechanical complicated.
Okay, so it's just such a bizarre statement. Some detailed, complicated. Here they're talking many worlds, wave functions, all kinds of babble. Heisenberg, Huygens, none of this is supposed to be complicated or strained or at all illogical or unintuitive, when that's exactly what it is. It's a made-up fairy story. It's a pixie freaking story. It's Gremlins, for fuck's sake. It's obviously some bizarre, extraordinary explanation for the phenomenon. It's a Sasquatch all over the place as a claim. It's not the freaking common, simple claim. It's a bizarrely uncommon, bizarrely unseen in the real universe anywhere claim. And here he is talking as if his UFO explanation is the glass of water, and that the silly mechanical explanation that no, that car hit that rabbit on the road, and the rabbit spun, and one of its ears fell off, and that's why you saw a one-eared rabbit. It wasn't really a unicorn rabbit. It was just a one-eared rabbit. Nothing bizarre. A perfectly rational explanation for what you saw. That he's calling a UFO theory. A complete upside down perversion of reality.
Explanation. It requires a broad new idea.
Yes, a broad new crazy idea, a UFO theory, a wacky, loony, random pandem world where photons somehow don't interact with matter. They just recognize that it exists, and they say, I have to divert my my movement because the matter existed and I have to acknowledge it. Now I have to do something completely idiotic for no good reason, but because the bent space says so. This is just a bent space bullshit. This is just more invisible magical forces instead of real forces. And you people eat this crap up and you sit there and admire and defend these people as good scientists and, you know, doing their best and being logical and being really intelligent. It's really intelligent not to describe the experiment honestly. It's really intelligent when it's a foundation of your whole wacky, stupid theory and you can't do it accurately.
About how statistics works and how about how the logic.
Yeah, again, it's just like this is about statistics when it's about causes. It's not about what we observe as effects. The effects are agreed upon. The causes is where you leave the building.
Of quantum mechanics works. So that's the first really weird thing that happens.
Okay, so in the rest, it gets into some other probability experiment that I'm not sure where that one's heading because I didn't watch all of it yet. So I just want to get to this, just another example. So I've got Professor Lewin doing it. I've got the guy at Yale doing it wrong. I've showed videos on YouTube by people who are supposed to be legitimate scientists saying it and doing it and showing it wrong. And now we got Susskind. So I'm showing you wrong. Feynman doing it wrong. Every single one of them hasn't been able to describe this dirt simple experiment. I mean, it's two freaking holes and a beam of light. It's dirt simple experiment, and they can't accurately describe what actually happens and when we actually discovered it. I mean, it's just amazing bullshit. And you people defend it. This is good science. It's horrible crap. And you should be ashamed of yourselves to give me all this grief because I'm sitting there doing the right thing, which is pointing out this should not be the foundation for your fundamental understanding of anything. This kind of crappy evidence should not persuade you. All right. So we'll do some comments. Let's see. So we did the depth of field. Okay. Pinhole camera always displays the image upside down. Yeah, that just has to do with distance. Of course, it has, you're just changing because you're not creating a focus. Obviously, you're spreading the image again. So you're creating another big image. So you go through the focus, past the focus, and respread the image. This always has bothered me. Why upside down? I see camera orchestra effect. Yeah, well, our eye is doing the same thing. It's just taking advantage of our retina is a big surface. So it's not doing the focusing thing. It's doing the spreading thing. So it's taking the light that goes, the image that essentially is on the surface of our lens, you know, it is brought to our lens, and our lens takes this little tiny image that got through our pupil, and now it's going to make it spread it. And so it's going to spread it by Xing it. It's going to focus it and then go past the focus and spread it across the big retina. So it's essentially making the image big. So it's taking a small image, making it really big so it can get more resolution out of it. Nothing mysterious. So why would the dark bands in the double slit disappear? So again, you're saying they do when you don't even have an experiment that proves that. And as I've pointed out, the reason why they do is because, as I've just pointed out, the same thing would happen with charge. If I have two charged plates, 10,000 volts, and I put another plate in between, I make 5,000 volts here and 5,000 volts here. I still have 10,000 volts here, but the potential on the interior surface is just 5,000. So can you understand how that would make a difference? So you can't, when you cover one of the slits, then you just make 5,000 and 5,000. You get it? But when you put the two slits next to each other, these two have the 10,000 potential. But they have to be close enough to create that effect. And the same is true in charge. You can have 5,000 volts over here and 5,000 volts over here, and you won't have 10,000 volts here. It's not until you bring the plates close enough where the center plate can balance the two charges, that is, go plus and minus, that you can have the full potential plus the secondary potential. The matter changes, okay? You can't understand that. Matter is affected by how thick it is. Matter is affected by, you know, how thick it is. Lots of things to affect how the surface of the matter is going to behave. Just like glass surfaces, you polish the glass and you change its reflective index. As you take little tiny layers off, you go from 16% reflective to 0% reflective, and then 16, and then 0, and then 16 and 0, you know, with 8, 4, and all that stuff in between. So you're polishing layers off of the glass. And the glass does essentially the same thing, in that the reflectivity is sort of in clumps, you know. All right. So why would the dark bands in the double slit disappear when you cover them? The part of the illustration is exactly what is seen in reality. So I'm just going to block you then. I mean, I've pointed out how it isn't what you see in reality. So you're just fucking full of shit. I've just explained how this isn't, his fucking clumps is not, those two humps have nothing to do with reality, have nothing to do with what Newton discovered, have nothing to do with rational expectations regarding photons. I mean, you're just obnoxious. Belligerently ignorant is all I can call this. This is just belligerent ignorant. I mean, the illustration is crap. Absolute crap. And you're defending it. That's the evidence you ignore. I mean, I just amazing, obnoxious bullshit. I'm ignoring what evidence? You're ignoring the facts. You fucking weasel. All right, whatever. Well, whatever. I have an idea to take care of this criticism. Fuck you. You're not, obviously, you haven't presented anything. So the photon gets captured. Who said that? Where does capture come into here? Anywhere? Redirected by the other electron shell of the atoms composing the slit profile. I don't know. It could be. There's no reason to think it doesn't happen that way. We know the electrons are repulsive for a reason. They're always repelling each other. All of the, you know, in many cases, electrons would fly right into the proton if the other electrons weren't in the way, saying you can't go there. That's the way the charge works. So the potential between the electrons is what creates voltage and creates energy. And so, yes, when a photon goes in and disturbs one of those electrons that's in tension, just like me taking a bunch of magnets that are in tension, if I put a bunch of magnets all the same face in between two layers of glass, I can create a circumstance where the magnets can't be pushed further in without pushing the other magnets further out. Just a fact. Oh, fuck. People are just amazing. So instead of conceding that this is a horrible description of the history and facts of these slit experiments, you're just going to sit there and do this bullshit. Amazing. Composing the slit profile. The outer electron shell of the atoms composing the slit profile. The point is that there's every expectation that there is what used to be called quantum electrodynamics. Quantum mechanics used to be called quantum electrodynamics. And quantum electrodynamics was merely a description of the fact that there is this relationship between photons and electrons, and that what photons do is perturbate. They disturb electrons, and that disturbance releases the energy that goes in, the energy comes out, and the energy also comes out at an angle. That's why there's a rainbow. That's why there's a prism. That's why there's a lot of things. You don't need quantum mechanics to understand that electrons cause photons to change their direction, for there to be a change in direction. Now, whether the actual fact is that the photon is, in fact, becomes part of the electron pressure, the voltage of the atom, and that the balance is restored when the electron moves back to its location. It doesn't like where it got moved by the photon, the higher pressure. The pressure is mitigated because the other electrons move. When the other electrons move, it sort of what goes around comes around, and that reduction in pressure comes back, and the electron moves back to its position and releases the photon. And it releases the photon based on the electron's new position. The electron doesn't move in straight lines, like it goes out and then comes back in. It moves out in an arc and then comes back in an arc. And that's why the new photon is released in a new direction, is because the angles of the electrons has been slightly altered by this change in the voltage between the electrons, change in the pressure. The change in the pressure means the electrons are in a different angle. They're in a different position. And so now when the photon's released, it's released at a different angle than the force actually came in. So the force comes in this direction, force goes out in this direction. Not really complicated. Oh, God, I hate your guts. Anyway, let's see. So this is a response to the master pool guy. All lenses produce an inverted image, including the human eye. Look at a geometric diagram of rays and you'll understand why. Well, again, all lenses don't necessarily produce an inverted image until you go past the focus. So I don't agree with your point. But fine. They can produce an inverted image is the point. You can do it at home, whatever that means. Camera obscurity effects is a pinhole, no lens. So again, you're just not even on the subject. The subject is quantum mechanics and the foundational experiment that led these people to draw these wacky conclusions about properties they think photons have, rather than paying any attention to the fact that material objects impose properties. They impose a circumstance, and the photons are merely obeying the circumstance produced by the material object. And as I've pointed out, the single needle experiment demonstrates the fact that this is about surfaces and it's not about openings. Fuckers. I think 90% of the light goes through the single slit in a straight line. That's right. And it's less than that for the double slit for the obvious reasons I've already pointed out. It's the other 10% that gets diffracted. Yes, not true with the two slits. Can you or any other flunkies explain this? I think I've already described a possible explanation. The first reason is that none of the light goes through parallel anymore because there's an impediment in the way, retard. So obviously there's no middle of the opening. The place where the most light would be, the most light's going through, is the very place where none of the light will get through. So the only light that can get through is light that bends around, so to speak, is diffracted by the surfaces. So obviously the center wouldn't have as much magnitude because you've taken away whatever, a 0.5 millimeter worth at the source of the light, you dumb fuck. Jeez. So do you get that, flunky? Mr. Fuck Flunky John Reynolds? Did you understand that fucking answer, you flunky? Are you too flunky stupid? Are you too flunky retarded to understand that there's an impediment directly in the middle of the fucking light source? Fuckhead! Could you think for 3 seconds and answer the question for yourself? No. All you can do is propagandize. Sell your fucking religion. That's all you fucking cunts can do. You don't even know your own damn religion. You haven't even read your own fucking Bible. You just preach this crap. That's why Susskind simplified. No, it's not a simplified model. It's a propagandist model. It doesn't tell the fucking story. It's not the truth. It doesn't illustrate anything that factually was experimentally observed. It's a big steaming pile of shit. And so are you. That's why Suskind's simplified model is what is this? Pragmatically? No, it's not useful at all unless you're a propagandist and a liar trying to sell a religion, trying to sell a pile of absolute crap by making it seem somehow mysterious when it's not fucking mysterious. God, you are such a weasel. Fuck you. Calm down, Gary. Go to fucking got fucking run over, you fucking lying piece of shit. This is grotesque propaganda. I've pointed it out. I've shown the deception and the lies just fucking spoken by this cunt, and you'll sit there and defend it. That's good science. Distortion and perversion and inaccuracy is good science. Fuck you. Fucking asshole. All right. Once I had a lamp. Oh, Jesus. You just can't stay on the subject. With a thick glass shade with a few circular holes in each about 0.75 centimeters in diameter. Well, that's a pretty big hole. Every one out of the circular holes would cast exactly 2 circular blobs of light on the wall. All right, so now I have to explain why a hole that big would create 2 images. Which I don't have an explanation off the top of my head unless it's the thickness of the bulb is actually the problem. There's the light from one side of the bulb is going this way, and the light from the other side of the bulb is going this way, and that's why you have 2 images. So if you have a point source light, like an LED or something small, it wouldn't happen. It's only happening because your source of illumination is so big that it's creating the 2 images from its peripheries. Something like that. We can influence photon streams into parallelity. Says you. Why don't you prove that one even? Make a laser beam that doesn't diverge. Go ahead. Let's see you do it. Can we make laser pointer light points 1 photon wide? No, you can't. Are those being used as well for that experiment? No, they're not. Laser beams diverge a lot. Just casting one 50 feet will maybe triple the size of the beam. Triple. You go a mile, you're going to end up with meters. The little dot will be meters across. We can influence photons. Oh, we just did that. All right. What's smooth for a human finger isn't smooth for a photon. Well, reasonable enough way to say it. Yes, there's no surface that isn't complex. And they're just simplifying the surfaces, right? They've taken the surfaces out of the experiment. They've assumed they're nothing to see here. The surfaces are irrelevant, when clearly the surfaces are why the event happens. It's the whole point of making the hole smaller is making the surface more relevant. Again, can't people understand that if I made a cage around you and I started making the cage, the cage was a mile across and I started making the cage smaller and smaller, you can't understand that all of a sudden the bars might be a problem, that you can't do anything without hitting a bar. Yeah, you could kind of understand that. And the photons are being put in the same exact circumstance. Confinement means you're forcing them to interact with matter. All right. They always do the comparison between the cue ball and the planet Earth to demonstrate the Earth's smoothness and the cue ball's non-smoothness. Well, I don't even know about that, but I mean, just saying relative to the atomic scale, it's ludicrous to even use the word smoothness because nothing on the subatomic level could be called smooth. It's not possible to make smooth. Question, do you say the electrons are weakly held between the slits? I say that that's where we should be looking for the explanation. I'm saying that all I need to do is I don't have to give you a theory of exactly how electrons work, but I've already done some of that. Clearly, I'm saying there's force between electrons. That force is essentially what photons are made out of. That's how photons are made. Electrons are far apart, you create red light. Electrons are close together, you create blue light. It's the pressure of the electrons, the voltage, that will decide the intensity of the electromagnetic radiation. That is how often, how quickly the little bits are released, the frequency. So yes, simple answer to your question, yes. Can light go through the middle of the other two slits? Can light go through the middle of the other two slits? That doesn't even, how can anybody make sense out of that? Can light go through the middle of the other two slits? I mean, there's no four slit thing described here. I don't know what you're asking me. You're clearly not asking me something I can answer because it's just not enough information provided. So anyway, generally speaking, the comments have been the same old bullshit. Just defend this absolutely thinly evidenced, silly theory. And it's silly explanations of causes, magical randomness. And again, if it's not magical randomness like Feynman, then it's this interference woo, which claims that photons have an ability to split into wave functions and that wave functions interfere with each other and that somehow it turns back into a photon that can figure out and do the math and figure out where it's supposed to be. Just absolute mush as an actual physical description of reality. And you people are clinging to that stuff so desperately, and you'll just sit there and insult anybody who just points out the obvious, that this is a misrepresentation of the experiment. It's a misrepresentation of what we know, okay, what the evidence is, and what can be reasonably deduced. And theirs is the deduction that is phantasmagorical, wacky, extraordinary, and there are plenty of reasonable ways you can dissect what's happening to photons when you're forcing them to interact with matter. And here you're so obnoxious. You're obnoxious to recognizing that 100 years ago, science went on wacky street. It got drunk on bent space and Heisenberg woo, and it's been drunk for 100 years, and it's time to sober it up. Bring it back to having an obligation to defend what it argues with something called real evidence, substantial evidence, not just claims. Everything that's an on-off pattern is interference. Everything. An absolute nonsensical claim. There's lots of ways to create an on-off pattern that don't have a damn thing to do with anything interfering. All right, so looks like that's about it for the idiots. It's all a limitation of our inability to measure an object smaller than any instrumentation available. It's all a limitation. Again, that has nothing to do with the argument. The argument is he's clearly perverting the evidence. He's presenting it in a distorted and deliberately inaccurate way, okay, to make his propaganda argument. This video is not about the fact that our evidence is always going to be weak. Yes, it's always going to be not substantial evidence. They're not conceding that. That's the point. The point is they're not conceding their evidence is weak, and they're not conceding it by trying to trump it up, try to pretend it's more than it is, that it's got a bigger dick than it has. And that's all this is I'm pointing out how they're on the thinnest of fucking ice, and you should just say, yes, they're way past their competency. They're way past where they should be making these declarations of we've done it. They haven't done shit in terms of demonstrating with proofs that they've got anything called a right theory. Well, I don't have much to say for this, but part of the problem is that you outright denied. I didn't deny anything, you fucking lying piece of shit. Denied basic algebra. Fuck you. I never did any such fucking thing, you lying piece of shit. Calling it rigged and lied about your theory fitting with Maxwell's equations. Oh, it's just a lie. I never lied about it. My theory does fit exactly what Maxwell predicts. Exactly. Where's my theory inconsistent with Maxwell? Well, fuck you. You've already lied enough in this comment. Fuck you, you lying piece of shit. I have no obligation to accept lying premises in your lying argument. You fucking liar. Let's see. That photons magically communicate. Well, I didn't even argue that crap. I mean, obviously their theory goes further and further down their drunken rabbit hole, with their silly, nonsensical, instantaneous communication, this silly entanglement crap, absolute unevidenced crap. And you people just swallow it. You just buy it. Oh, they say so, so I'll believe in it. Obvious crap. But the point is look, I'm showing you their foundational experiment, and I've shown you every single one of these fucking cunts can't honestly describe the actual physical experiments that have actually physically been done. And they'll even cite experiments that haven't been done, where we tried to measure the photon. No, you never tried to do that. We tried to detect which slit they went to. Oh, no, you never tried to do that even with electrons. You haven't tried to do it with buckyballs, the ones that you actually could detect which slit they go through, and you haven't tried it. Why? Oh, because you'll find out it's a pile of shit and has nothing to do with anything. And detecting doesn't have a damn thing to do with this. Disturbing has something to do with it. So if you don't disturb them too much, they'll do exactly what they were doing before, which is not paying any attention to your bullshit, and they're paying attention to the fact that they're being manipulated by forces connected to matter, which is a perfectly rational thing to expect, that there are forces connected to the surfaces of matter. I'm not defending them. Fuck you. I'm just relatively ignorant. Well, then you shouldn't preface your arguments as if you're qualified to say their assertions are in some way correct or their illustration is adequate. I was always offended by their randomness assertion. Well, this video just said it over and over, right? Random kick. He just says this random kick shit. Like we're all supposed to know what a random fucking kick is. And also by time being a dimension. Well, again, another, yes, not part of this idiot horse shit, but yes, obviously a nonsensical notion in the sense that it's just a function. Yeah, a universe that has something other than an instantaneous force is stuck with having time. As soon as you don't do everything instantaneously, well, you've invented time. They say random, but it's just our inability to get precise measurements at that scale. So you just keep saying the same shit. Not being able to get precise measurements does not excuse distortions and perversions. So again, just keep fucking veiling your up their ass bullshit. They're not going to concede these points. They think Heisenberg is real. They don't think Heisenberg is a recognition that we can't measure the smallest thing in the universe. They actually are asserting that the smallest thing in the universe has no measurability because it doesn't have a location. And they have no evidence for that conclusion, yet they're sure that's the truth. And that's what they argue. So let's understand that they are arguing from the incredibly weak evidence position. They have shit for evidence. That's why they have to distort the evidence that exists. Is because they have so fucking little evidence for any of this wacky fucking woo that they've been made up. Oh, damn it. You people just don't get the program here. What you're supposed to do is just say, very good video, Gary. It needs to be pointed out that the premises of quantum mechanics are weakly evidenced and they don't deserve the confidence that people assert this crap with. They have no reason to walk around thinking they've got it. They've got a pile of fucking UFO turd. All right. People just very frustrating. Humans. But 3.5 thousand thumbs up, 142 thumbs down. So of course those are probably all just religious nuts. But nobody calls any of these assholes out on any of this crap. Just distort the evidence, distort the facts to make your silly frickin' God theory real. And that's all this is. It's just physics is just a fucking religion. Anyway, enough of a video, I suppose. Or my red shirt, even though it's hot, because I figured I was going to get pissed. And I did. Oh, maybe I'll read this one dopey comment because it is a religious kook who sits there and wastes his time posting this crap on my channel. The latest research all points to our reality as being engineered by higher intelligence. What research, retard? Every bit of new evidence just points more and more to the fact that we just evolved here, retard. All right, the more we engineer, the more it is revealed to copy that which came before in nature. Yeah, well, we don't really engineer. Engineering is just discovering how things work. You know, you can stack two bricks on top of each other and then you can cement them together. We're just discovering things. Engineering isn't like inventing anything. You're just discovering what is possible. That's all. So again, of course it's going to fit with nature because it's nature that we're engineering, you idiot. You fucking idiot. Simply put, the more it is revealed that both are singly and collectively focused intelligence produces methods, contrivances, and concepts that mimics those in nature. Yeah, again, there's obvious things you need, like shields and swords, you know, pushers and pullers, and, you know, it's kind of obvious. Yes. So this means there's a God because there's push and pull, and we can use push and pull to do different things, that therefore we must believe in God. You're an idiot. The more it is revealed that nature did not come about by blind, mindless chance. Well, it certainly was mindless. The idea that it was blind is kind of a, you know, silly way of putting it. But clearly it has attributes, and attributes lead to consequences. So that's just the way it works. You have the ability to do something, then the something might happen because you have the ability to make something happen. But it was itself created by focused intelligence. So you think focused intelligence, you know, created anal warts and cancer and malaria and AIDS viruses. Focused intelligence did that. You're a fucking idiot. I hope you get polio and choke to death, you creep. That is, unless one is satisfied that man's wisest mechanizations are infinite compared to the results of blind chance, are infinite. Yeah, who cares? You know, again, this idea of blind chance doesn't say anything because it's ordered chance in the sense that it has to go through a process of cause and effect. I don't know what to say. This pen can fall different ways depending on how much wind is blowing. It can twist and turn in the wind. I don't need to believe in a God to understand there's wind. It doesn't need a God to make the wind. You're an idiot. My point is that you and Ken Wheeler, myself, everyone, discussing the finer points of reality 101. Well, you're not doing that, and Ken Wheeler certainly isn't doing that. And you certainly don't know what evidence. Neither one of you know what evidence is. And so you're, you know, doing something entirely different than what I'm doing. is a huge waste of time. Yes, it's a waste of time to you pretend that you can do science without knowing anything about science. That you can be an ignorant fucking cunt and just automatically know science because you know God. Spend that time to get to know our creator. What? The holy cunt. They've got the better DNA than the males, They had the nipples first. Clearly, God's a chick, idiot. He's at the center of everything. I mean, clearly we had to come second, right? You don't put nipples. If you're making Adam and you say, "Oh, wait a minute, I gotta make some more stuff." Why would the males have nipples, idiot? Right? No use, idiot. All right, so he's got some sort of creation science website here or something. We'll just go real quick. Huge media blackout regarding supermoons, orbital and axis changes, quakes, and tsunamis. So they think that the moon and the other galaxies are creating earthquakes on Earth or something. The recent supermoons, of which there have been 3. Oh my God, supermoons! Like there's such a thing as a supermoon. Oh, these people are just amazingly stupid. Oh God, too stupid. All right, never mind. Fuck off, idiot. You belligerently ignorant cunt. I just hate people. Oof. Oof. So the good news is, Stephen Bro is going to do the radio experiment, radar, microwaves. Hopefully he won't get killed. But he's got the equipment and everything, so we should be able to get that happening. And so that'll be really fantastic. And he's very good. I mean, he does very good experiments, I think. Took down some of his older videos, which I liked, but, maybe he'll put them back up and do some other stuff. But anyway, good stuff. So that's good news. Let's see. All right. I'm not defending them. Okay, we said that. They say random, but it's just an inability to get precise measurements. Yep, same crap. A religion with instruments of sophistication, which enforce a perceived skill gap between the popes and the populace. Genetic fallacy. I don't know. Argument from authority. I don't know. Whatever. I don't know. Our records aren't running at the same speed here exactly, but okay. Fine. It's not how I would have said it, of course, but whatever. Cigarettes today. Yeah, it's really nice. Unfortunately, I've smoked a whole pack of cigarettes in about 6 hours, but thank you, you know who, of course. But yeah, it is a. I do love smoking. I just do. And I shouldn't, but I do. Oh, real cigarettes. Real cup of coffee would be nice too. But anyway. Yeah, don't do that anymore. Okay. Anyway, till the next time, and such, and so forth and whatnot. This video probably get, like the last video had like 30 downvotes to 10 upvotes or something. Incredible ratio. This one will probably be worse. But that'll just demonstrate my point that you're all fucking fanatics. You're all just sycophants, minions, and you don't know what the fuck you're believing in. You're just dupes. You're just stupid fucking dupes. You've been duped. You've been fooled. You've been shenaniganed into believing nonsense. You're living in a fake world, a fake reality, and it's all of your own fucking belligerent doing because when somebody points out how flawed your icons are and how bad they are and how they haven't done their job and how their evidence does suck, you just sit there and pretend it ain't true. It can't be true. My guy's a good guy. He doesn't beat his wife. You're just like a Yankee fan or something. You know, our players can use steroids and our players can beat their wives and our players can rape women. It's those other assholes who can't. You're just such fucking dupes, such fucking hypocrites. Ugh. Ugh. The world sucks because you people suck. That's that simple. Fucking pieces of suck. Anyway. Yeah. Enough contempt for the evening. So, till the next time and such.